Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. People are joining us from around the world. Welcome to this webinar on preserving the humanitarian nature of resettlement. I'm Sasha Chanoff, and I'm the founder and executive director of RefugePoint. We know this is a really busy time for everybody, so we're grateful that all of you are joining us today. And we're pleased to see the amount of interest that there's been in this report and in this webinar. I'm really pleased to see colleagues from the UN and government representatives and international and local NGOs and philanthropists and academics and RefugePoint board members and supporters joining us here today. This is a really consequential moment in both American and global history, as the numbers of those displaced have increased to beyond 1% of humanity. And among those who fled to neighboring countries and are refugees, they live for an average of 2 decades or longer in situations of exile. Resettlement is one of the few solutions that is the most predictable for refugees who have fled and are seeking safety. It's also the one solution that is focused on those who are most at risk, who need resettlement as a life-saving solution because they can not return home, and they also don't have a way to find safety in the countries to which they fled. RefugePoint, as many of you know, focuses on reaching the most at risk refugees and finding solutions for them. So one of the questions is, how do we do that? And this report is actually an answer to that question. You'll see that we examine in this report equitable access to resettlement. Is resettlement actually reaching the people who need it the most to save their lives? We do this sort of analysis across the African continent and have been for many years, but we now applied our lens of analysis around equitable access to resettlement globally in the hopes that what we've done in our own work can help to instruct maybe a broader community and a broader response around reaching the most at-risk people. It's such a consequential moment because the US is starting to reclaim its leadership mantle in terms of resettlement. We've seen this with the presidential determination last week. President Biden announced a ceiling of 125,000 refugees who will be coming to the US or allowed to come in the next year. We timed this report around the time that that presidential determination would be announced, so we could emphasize the importance of reaching people who need resettlement as a life-saving solution. At the same time, we are all so acutely aware of the crisis and emergency in Afghanistan with American withdrawal and Taliban takeover and the evacuations and people who are fleeing. And it's unclear at this point if all those people who are coming to the US, our Afghan allies and others who are fleeing, will be part of that 125,000. But in any case, it is an important recognition that the US has space and welcoming for those most at risk. But as we focus on this acute crisis, we can't forget about all those others who are displaced and in the most vulnerable situations. 2.8 million Afghans have fled over the past 40 years before the current crisis. But we can't forget about those Syrians, Venezuelans, people from so many different countries, Rohingya from Myanmar, people who are fleeing today from the Tigray region of Ethiopia, South Sudanese and Congolese and Somalis, and others who have fled over many years and often are in situations of crisis. So this report is an attempt to say to the world, we must not forget about those most at risk, and we must make sure that resettlement is done in the most equitable way. We're pleased to share it with you, and we're also really grateful for those who have joined us to put this report together, our readers, those people who helped to give us input and guidance around this report, colleagues from UNHCR, HIAS, and Church World Service. So as we go into this discussion, I just want to note the important historic moment that we have reached and the importance of using resettlement as a mechanism to reach people who might not otherwise survive. I'm really thrilled to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to turn it over in a moment to our first speaker, who's Janet Ouma. She is our resettlement program coordinator based in Nairobi. Janet helps to oversee over 40 staff that RefugePoint has across Africa and the world, who are helping to identify those refugees who will be referred for resettlement. So Janet, I'm pleased to welcome you. It's been a pleasure and an honor really to work with you. I've known you for so many years, and you joined RefugePoint 7 years ago, but you were a senior protection officer with the UN Refugee Agency before that. And I love working with you. So I'll turn it over to you now, Janet. Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha. For the analysis in this report, we looked at resettlement submissions from the past 3 years as compared to the total refugee populations in each country of asylum and as compared to UNHCR's projected resettlement needs. We use this data to answer 2 questions. 1, to what extent do refugees everywhere have access to resettlement? And 2, to what extent do refugees in need of resettlement have access to it? From the outset, we want to acknowledge the adverse context that greatly constrained resettlement these past few years, resulting in lower than usual outcomes. As we know, there was a dramatic reduction in the US resettlement program during the Trump administration, which had the ripple effects throughout the resettlement system. COVID then came along and restricted movement and operational ability to conduct resettlement. Next slide, please. Given these realities, it is not surprising that outcomes were low for this time period. Overall, only 1/3 of 1% of refugees globally were submitted for resettlement, and only 5% of refugees identified as in need of resettlement were submitted. Despite these challenges, there were a number of bright spots, such as the general expansion of resettlement infrastructure in recent years to include more locations and populations. In 2019, for instance, UNHCR submitted refugees from 81 countries of asylum globally. This means that despite global contraction, access to resettlement remains possible in approximately half of all countries of asylum. Next slide, please. Amy and Matti will go into more detail on the 2 inquiry questions which underlined our 2 analytical approaches. I will just provide an overview of the 2 analyses and share this graphic. Analysis 1 looks at the geographic distribution of resettlement opportunities, or what we are calling equitable access. It compares the number of resettlement submissions to the total refugee population in each country of asylum. In other words, it compares the green circle to the yellow circle. Analysis 2 looks at how well identified resettlement needs are met. It compares the number of resettlement submissions to the projected resettlement needs in each country of asylum. In other words, it compares the green circle to the orange circle. As might be expected, this analysis revealed disparities across different countries of asylum, and we should take a moment to acknowledge some legitimate reasons why this may be so. A non-exhaustive list includes issues related to geographic accessibility, political and security dynamics, lack of permission from the host country to conduct resettlement, human and financial resource limitations, and pandemic-related movement and operational restrictions, among others. Despite the numerous reasons that submissions might be lower from some countries other than others, it is our view that regularly engaging in these analyses could help the global resettlement system better meet the needs of refugees. Next slide, please. Attention is often rightly placed on growing overall resettlement numbers. This is undoubtedly important, as we just saw that resettlement reaches such a small percentage of those in need. We are concerned, however, that too little attention is paid to how resettlement opportunities are distributed across geographies and populations. It is imperative that we focus on both, growing the volume of resettlement and making it more equitable simultaneously. It may at first glance appear that these two goals are in tension with one another, that they grow in inverse proportions as if in a zero-sum game. There are certainly difficult resource trade-offs that must be made each year, as high volume resettlement sites cost less per capita than low volume ones. Over time, however, we have seen that expanding resettlement infrastructure to more countries of asylum can allow for greater volume in the long run. More nuanced reporting has a role to play here. Often, resettlement statistics focus on a global totals of top 10 countries, which can tell a success story at the highest level, while obscuring what's happening in the roughly 130 countries that do not make the top 10 list. Next slide, please. We cannot neglect the crucial role that quotas and criteria play in limiting both the volume and equity of resettlement. We are referring to the quotas made available by receiving states and the selection criteria that they often layer on top of UNHCR's criteria. In recent years, it has become increasingly common for states to add restrictions relating to any number of characteristics, including age, sex, ethnicity, religion, family size, health status, language ability, and more. It's also true that issues related to cost and expediency cause states to limit the number of processing locations they engage with. And this further marginalizes refugees living in many hundreds of other locations around the world. UNHCR regularly reminds states of the need to keep resettlement protection focused. This language is in both the Global Compact on Refugees and the 3-year strategy on resettlement. The GCR further calls on states to dedicate at least 10% of their quota to unallocated places for UNHCR to use at its discretion. Given the limitations many states are placing on cases they will accept, these unallocated quotas are key to meeting humanitarian needs in many locations. In a moment, Amy and Matti will share more detail on the two analyses. But first, I'll pass back to Sasha.
Thanks, Janet, so much for that. And thanks to, I know that you are extraordinarily busy hiring people, deploying people, and helping to oversee all of our work. RefugePoint, as people know, we have referred nearly 100,000 refugees directly for resettlement from locations across Africa and around the world since we started in 2015. And we also train other organizations as well and have helped to train thousands of others. It's my pleasure now to introduce Amy Slaughter, RefugePoint's senior advisor, based here in our Cambridge office outside of Boston. Amy has been a leader at RefugePoint since she started in 2008 and has helped to guide our organization, its growth, and our strategy. Amy, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sasha, and thanks everyone for joining today. Before I share analysis one, I wanted to say a little bit about our methodology and our data sources. Next slide, please. We pulled data from 3 different publicly available UNHCR sources listed here, and we had to manually adjust them for consistency in terms of the naming of countries and regional groupings before we could compare them to ensure that we were comparing apples to apples. And I think it's worth emphasizing that it took quite a bit of work to do this, to combine these 3 different data sets to even make this analysis possible, because it's unlikely that very many resettlement stakeholders would have the time to do it. So this is actually one of our key recommendations that we'll return to at the end of the presentation, that this data should ideally be collated and shared publicly every year to allow for easy observation of trends. Next slide, please. As Janet noted, the first analysis attempts to answer the question, to what degree do refugees everywhere have access to resettlement? In short, we call this our equitable access analysis. And this is a simple mathematical approach. It divides the number of resettlement submissions by the number of refugees in each country to derive a percentage. The advantage of this approach is that these are entirely objective numbers with no subjective judgment of relative need involved. It assumes that within nearly every refugee population, there likely exists some percentage of refugees needing resettlement. And we understand, of course, that needs are not actually distributed evenly across locations and populations, but we still think it's useful to look at the data in this way and at least interrogate the disparities. Next slide, please. For comparison across geographies, we chose 1% of the refugee population as the benchmark. 1% is a figure that's often quoted in the resettlement field, as you see in this graphic from a recent UNHCR publication, even though the actual global average is usually lower. Over the past 18 years, the average has been 0.68% of the global population resettled. But we went ahead and used the rounded up figure of 1% in order to compare the relative degree of resettlement from country to country and across regions to see how each location tracked against the benchmark over the past 3 years. Next slide, please. As you see in figure 4 from the report, and as Janet noted, during the past 3 years, 0.33% of refugees worldwide were submitted for resettlement. And the adjusted global total that you see in the second to the bottom row removes resettlement receiving countries from the calculations, since these countries are not typically also sending countries. And when they're removed, the percentage is bumped a little bit higher. You can also see that the differences among the 5 major global regions were stark. None of the regions reached 1%, though interestingly, the sub-region of Southern Africa did. And at the high end are the Americas and MENA, and at the low end is Asia and the Pacific. And with this data, we can begin to make comparisons. For instance, comparing the highest and lowest regions, we can say that a refugee in the Americas is 7 times more likely to be submitted for resettlement than a refugee in Asia and the Pacific, and nearly twice as likely as refugees in Africa. Next slide, please. Another way to use this data is to consider how many countries reached or exceeded 1% resettlement, whether this trend line is improving or worsening, and how countries across the globe compare to one another. As you see here in figure 5, of the 142 countries that hosted refugees, 45 or 32% met the benchmark. The MENA region had the highest percentage of countries reaching the benchmark, followed closely by the Americas, and at the low end was Europe with 0. Next slide, please. We also wanted to look more granularly at how close countries came to reaching the benchmark. So we analyzed the sub-thresholds of 0 to 0.49% and 0.5 to 0.99%. You can see in this chart that the vast majority fell in the lowest bracket and that most countries were not even close to reaching 1%. This reflects that resettlement is concentrated in about 1/3 of countries of asylum, while refugees in other countries have much less access to it. As Janet mentioned, it's not our intention to dwell on the results from 3 of the hardest years in resettlement history, and we do understand that there are often good reasons why more resettlement happens in some places than others. But we wanted to share these examples of what the data can tell us, and we think a routine study of these variances can help support planning and strategy conversations among all stakeholders in the global resettlement system. So thank you for bearing with this rather dry statistical summary, and I will hand it back to Sasha now.
Thanks, Amy. I think it is worth pointing out what those statistics actually mean. You said dry statistical summary. I know we've really kind of geeked out on these numbers, but it's because they mean something very significant. We're working, for example, with unaccompanied children who have lost both their parents and are in places of great desperation. And we found aunts and uncles and others who can take them in countries that can bring them in as part of a resettlement quota. So when we talk about people who are the most at risk, we're talking about unaccompanied children who are 10, 12 years old, even younger, and for whom resettlement will really save their lives. So when you think about the data, that's what the data means to us. I'm really pleased now to introduce Marty Anderson. He's our Director of International Programs and our representative in Geneva. Has also been, along with Janet and Amy, a real visionary in helping to build RefugePoint, and he's based, not unsurprisingly, in Geneva in our office there. Marty, over to you.
Thank you, Sasha. And hello to everybody else. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's really nice to be here with you. Our second analysis attempts to answer the question, to what degree do refugees in need of resettlement actually have access to it? And to try to answer this question, we used 2 data points, both of which are publicly available. Number 1, the number of refugees submitted for resettlement by country of asylum for each year 2018 to 2020. And number 2, the number of refugees in need of resettlement by country of asylum for each year 2018 to 2020. With those data points, it's then easy enough to divide the number of refugees submitted for resettlement into the number of refugees in need of resettlement, to then calculate the percentage of refugees in need of resettlement who were actually able to access it each year by country of asylum. It's worth noting or acknowledging briefly that there's no perfect method for estimating the exact number of refugees in any country who will be in need of resettlement the following year, which means that while our numerator, the number of submissions, is an exact count, our denominator, the number of refugees in need of resettlement, is admittedly an imperfect approximation. However, though this might raise questions about the precision of our analysis, we believe that it doesn't really call into question the principle behind it. The idea that resettlement submissions should, to the greatest degree possible, track the needs as projected by UNHCR. Next slide, please. As can be seen here in figure 7 from our report, there's remarkable consistency between regions and across all 3 years of our analysis. On average, 5% of resettlement needs were met over the course of the past 3 years, as you can see in the bottom right corner of the table. And 4 of 5 regions clustered around this average, as you can see in the far right column. The one very clear outlier was the Americas, where 50% of needs were met. So this means that during the past 3 years, a refugee in need of resettlement in the Americas was almost exactly 10 times more likely to actually be referred for resettlement than a refugee also in need of resettlement living elsewhere. As an interesting aside, the effects of the COVID pandemic can be seen by looking across the bottom line of the table, which shows a significant decline in the percentage of needs met in 2020. Since we're looking here at submissions, which often take many months and sometimes years to become arrivals, this may have consequences for our resettlement pipeline for years to come. Next slide, please. Though our analysis shows remarkable regional consistency, more significant disparities start to reveal themselves when looking at individual countries, as can be seen in figure 8 from our report. In the report itself, this is a table of more than 30 countries, though here we've extracted just the top and the bottom of the table. To quickly summarize the broadest takeaway here, a refugee in need of resettlement and living in one of the 3 countries at the top of the table, that's Ecuador, Indonesia, and Malaysia, was approximately 250 times more likely to actually be referred for resettlement than a refugee also in need of resettlement, but living in one of the 3 countries at the bottom of the table, DRC, Iran, and South Sudan. But before moving on, I do want to pause to subvert that data ever so slightly, but hopefully in service of a larger point. For purposes of something like statistical significance, we elected to include in this table only those countries with an average resettlement needs greater than 1,000 individuals between 2018 and 2020. However, a major point of our report, as Amy has already highlighted, is that refugees everywhere should have access to resettlement, and that includes, of course, refugees living in countries where overall resettlement needs are not so great. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'd like to add a quick note on complementary pathways, and in particular on the principle of additionality. It's a precept that we all cite often in conversations these days, that complementary pathways should be in addition to resettlement. However, I don't think that we've yet done the hard work of actually assessing our complementary pathways in a systematic way to determine which of them are truly additional to resettlement and which might be competing with it or might begin to do so over time, and often in ways that we don't even realize. In our report, we propose a hypothetical test question that could be asked of any given complementary pathway. In the absence of any other measure, would growing this particular pathway lead to a reduction in needs-based resettlement? Another approach might be to suggest a more numerical principle. For example, that for every new quota for complementary pathways, the same destination state should increase its needs-based resettlement pathway by at least as much. This being a report and a presentation on equitable access to needs-based resettlement, I won't say more about complementary pathways at this time, other than to note that we at RefugePoint look forward to continuing our work with many of you to further develop these programs and these ideas. Thanks very much to everyone, and thanks to you, Sasha, as well. Back to you.
Thanks, Marty. I realize that for some of you, you may be nodding your head saying, yeah, this makes total sense, but it is a lot of insider baseball. So for those of you who are not as familiar with the resettlement space, please do reach out if you want some clarification here, because we've put this report together, obviously, with a great deal of time and effort, and it is really detailed in terms of how we think about resettlement and how we can think about reaching people who need it as a life-saving solution. I'm really thrilled to introduce Elvin Mokeira to you. She's our Senior Child Protection Officer, or a Senior Child Protection Officer. We have many of them, but she is one of our leaders. I remember when she joined RefugePoint in 2005, over 15 years ago now, in our Nairobi office. And it's been such a pleasure to watch her grow with our organization, to see the leadership she's taken on. She has worked across the world in some of the most desperate situations with unaccompanied children. I remember speaking to her about her time working with Yazidis in northern Iraq who had escaped ISIS captivity, unaccompanied children who were looking to reunite with their family members, and in other places of extraordinary desperation. Elvin, I don't know how you manage to do the work you do every day. She is in Addis Ababa right now, and while she's with us, because the internet might not be stable, she has pre-recorded a video, so I'm going to play that for you now.
Hi everyone, my name is Elvin Mokeira, a child protection expert with RefugePoint. I'm happy to be talking to you today about resettlement of unaccompanied children. Unaccompanied children are one of the most vulnerable groups among the refugees that we serve. They require stable and long-term care to be able to thrive. Resettlement is one of the durable solution options that provides such stable and long-term care. However, for this vulnerable group, accessing this service can be challenging. It's actually one of the operational challenges in meeting the projected resettlement needs. This is because decisions on durable solutions are serious and they have a long-term impact on the lives of children, and thus cannot be undertaken without the establishment and application of adequate safeguard measures. One of such safeguard measures is the requirement that all unaccompanied and separated children undergo a best interest procedure before they can be considered for resettlement. This is to determine whether resettlement is in their best interests. However, best interest procedures are time-consuming. They require various interviews, numerous interviews with children. This is because it's difficult to have one comprehensive interview with a child and get all the information at once. So depending on so many factors, the situation of the child, whether the child has any medical condition, the age, it might take time. It might take several interviews before you can get full information. It also requires interviews with other individuals who are close to the child, including teachers, medical personnel, and other professionals who are dealing with the child. Apart from that, it requires several steps of review before a decision can be taken, which is in the best interest of the child. Staff who are conducting best interest procedures also require specialized training before they can undertake these best interest procedures. As such, most of the operations do not have sufficient capacity to be able to undertake these best interest procedures. In one of the locations that I served, the caregivers, because they were afraid that their resettlement cases will take time, when they had children who were not their biological children, they started to come to the office telling us that the children had gone back to their parents, while in reality, these children had been passed on to other families so that their cases could go faster. It's thus very important that more investment in the area of child protection, more specifically staffing for staff who will be able to conduct these interviews, and trainings in the best interest procedures are undertaken so that these challenges can be overcome. Similarly, other complex cases like medical cases that require specialized staff or external providers also face similar challenges. So it's also important to look into these areas where individuals with complexities who are being left behind or their cases are left until the end could be prioritized and they are processed on time. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Elvin. I know you're here with us in person, so I am thanking you in person. But thanks too for highlighting the critical needs of unaccompanied children. One of the things that RefugePoint does do, all of those 40 plus staff that we have across the world, many of them who are focused on unaccompanied children, have the bandwidth and funding to also provide training to other organizations so we can expand access and expand resources and understanding for resettlement. So we've assisted, I think, over 10,000. We've trained over 10,000 staff of other agencies along with the other work we do. So if you look in the chat, you'll see a link to this report. I'd just like to summarize a few of the high-level recommendations that we make. One is around data analysis and transparency. That is, we think that this sort of data analysis is a real key to understanding where the gaps are and then how we can act to fill those gaps. Another set of recommendations, these are kind of buckets of recommendations that we've put together in this report, is the diverse, flexible, needs-based programming. That is that we want to ensure that resettlement systems are responsive both to emerging needs and ongoing needs, and that there's flexibility in them so that people, when we identify people or other organizations identify people who need resettlement to save their lives, that states actually have the flexibility to accommodate those kinds of resettlement referrals. And the third set of recommendations is really around fostering closer partnerships among all these stakeholders engaged in resettlement, from the UN Refugee Agency to governments to the private sector, donors, NGOs, and primarily refugees themselves, who often have little or no say in this whole process. We really encourage a closer collaboration among all stakeholders so that we can be more effective for those who are most at risk. So thanks to everybody at RefugePoint who have worked so hard to put this report together, and thanks to all of you for listening. We're going to now turn to questions. And in this question and answer period, I would encourage you, if you do want to ask a question, to either do so by raising your hand or putting a question in the question and answer section that you see on the screen. But to start us off, I'm actually going to call on Mark Hetfield, who's the president and CEO of HIAS, a leading organization in refugee protection and resettlement around the world. I can't say enough about their leadership, both at this moment, but over their 120-year history. But it's also worth mentioning that HIAS was a real inspiration because of their focus on the most at risk for RefugePoint's founding. And Mark, I hope you're here and that we can unmute you so that you can provide a comment or two about this.
Thanks, Sasha, and thanks so much for your leadership and RefugePoint's leadership in releasing this really important report. And also thank you for sharing it with us prior to release. And I noticed that our comments were taken into account, and the report was revised to incorporate some of those comments. So thank you so much. I want to make 3 points, which I'd love to hear responses to if there's time with regard to the report, and I'll be as quick as I can. One is the report underscores some really important issues about equity. And I just wanted to make a reflection that not only are these uneven submissions that you've identified an issue of equity, but it also creates big problems for host countries, because refugees are very rational actors, and they do act in their best interest. They have better access to information, I think, than you and I do, in terms of what countries UNHCR is making referrals in and which countries it is not. And so for that reason, extreme variations from country to country does create, does promote migration, because refugees, again, are going to the country where they're going to have the best chance of finding protection and a durable solution. UNHCR has traditionally given a lot of deference to its country offices in making decisions about resettlement submissions, but your report emphasizes the real importance for not just a regional approach, but a global approach. And I'm hoping that UNHCR's recent move toward regionalization will at least help facilitate a more consistent approach from country to country. And then ultimately even it out between regions. The other point I wanted to make was one that I made in my comments, and I saw that were incorporated in the report. And that is the data that is analyzed in this report focuses entirely on submissions, which means cases that are referred by the UN Refugee Agency to countries. And that's totally valid in terms of doing an analysis of whether or not UNHCR is taking an equitable approach in terms of it's referring refugees for a resettlement from country to country. But the statistic that really matters at the end of the day is not submissions, it's departures. If UNHCR is submitting cases to a country and those refugees are not actually departing, that frankly is creating more harm than good. It's really important for UNHCR to share statistics, not just on what it's submitting to countries, but which of those refugees, how many of those refugees are actually departing, because a submission doesn't give you a solution. A submission doesn't protect you. If anything, it makes you more vulnerable if you don't actually get resettled as a result of that submission. And the third point I want to make is the point that I always make, because as a resettlement agency, one of the biggest impediments that we see to successful integration is when families remain separated, when families remain apart. It's really important to take into account the principle of family unity, which is a right. I think RefugePoint in the report correctly depicts family unity as being really a complementary pathway, because it's something that states really have to do. It's not discretionary. If you resettle somebody, you have to resettle their spouse and their children as a human right. That has to be done. So I think it's important to emphasize that complementary pathways aren't necessarily any less important than refugee resettlement. There is nothing more important than family reunification. But I totally agree with the point that RefugePoint makes, which is it should be complementary. It should be separate and apart from cases that are referred on the basis of vulnerability. Thank you.
Man, Mark, I'm just, I don't know if you wing it or not, but I watch you in all these high-level meetings and you seem to have just all the information right at your fingertips. I don't know how you have time to do it all. Thank you for those really important comments on this. I'll ask our panelists now to unmute and come onto the screen as well, so we can actually engage a little with Mark, some of the questions and comments that you have raised, and then we can go to other questions as well. So Marty, perhaps I'll turn to you first to see which of Mark's 3 points you'd like to highlight, and then see if others also want to add in. But Marty, go ahead.
Sure. If you don't mind, Sasha, I will try to respond very briefly to all three of them. First and foremost, by just saying that we completely agree. I think, Mark, to your first point about the unevenness from one country of asylum to another, in my mind, that's a good point for us to add as rationale for our overall thesis if we were to do this report again in future years. I think it really supports what we're trying to say. Our vision here is that a refugee in need of resettlement should have access to resettlement no matter where that refugee may be. And so we want those systems in place fully and equitably in all countries of asylum. And think that your point is very much in support of that thesis that we're trying to advance. On your second point about departures, once again, we completely agree. I think here, what we're trying to do is really focus on the part of the process where RefugePoint intersects with the resettlement system. Unlike HIAS and so many of our peer organizations with RC USA in the US and other organizations too, we don't really focus on the receiving side of the resettlement system. We focus on the overseas side of the system. Our work is grounded in that identification side of the system. And so that's just where we intersect with the conversation, but absolutely the goal of the system, our goal, everybody's goal, we're all working together towards departures. And we, once again, completely agree with you. And on your last point about family unity, in an earlier version of my remarks for today, I actually included the comment that in some sense, I think that we do the principle of family unity a disservice by lumping it in with complementary pathways. It should be elevated to its own higher status as, like you described, as a right. And we should be emphasizing that it is a right. It's not complementary to anything. It's first and foremost among all of the pathways in many ways. And so not to sound totally uncontroversial, but I think that we just agree with you, Mark. Thanks for your comments.
Thanks, Marty. Janet, I want to just turn it over to you to see if you'd like to comment on Mark's thoughts as well.
Yes, just to second Marty and definitely agree, especially around approaches. And thankfully, with the strengthening of the UNHCR's regional bureau, I know there have been discussions to try and come up with systemic and consistent approaches to resettlement across the regions. And we are, hopeful that with the strengthening and redefining of the role of the region, that they will be really centralized around ensuring that countries within the region apply the same approaches towards pushing for more equity. Definitely from the East African region, we've seen the spontaneous movements to locations where there are increased opportunities for resettlement. And just to agree and hoping that the discussion and the issues will move forward towards this practical approaches in helping UNHCR apply the same approaches across the board. Thank you.
Thanks, Janet. I'll just say one other thing about that really important point of family unity. I do see here one of our colleague organizations, International Refugee Assistance Project, or IRAP, has joined us. And RefugePoint, IRAP, and the UN Refugee Agency do have a pilot project that's actually growing quite significantly to look at reuniting unaccompanied children with family members and emphasizing that importance of family unity. So I see a wonderful question from our colleague Janet Dench in Canada, and she writes, do we know to what extent UNHCR disparities in rate of submission versus needs is due to pressures from resettlement countries? It's such a great question. I mean, if you think about the past 4 years and what we have referred to as the former president's Muslim ban, you see that the US was only interested in taking certain nationalities and excluding other people who were extraordinarily vulnerable, and there were absolutely no reasons to exclude them other than false xenophobia and fear-mongering. But we see with many countries that there are a lot of interests focused specifically on skills, and on, as we've highlighted in the discussion, what refugees bring to the table as opposed to who needs resettlement to save their lives. So Janet, I really appreciate this question. I'm going to turn it over to Amy to see if you want to comment, Amy.
Sure, thanks. And yeah, Janet, it is a great question. I think, it's probably impossible to quantify, but I would say to a very great extent, the pressure from resettlement countries is dictating the submissions that are being made. And that's been a trend, I think, that's been increasing over the years. We try to trace the history of this a bit in the report, but, going back 10 or 15 years, the problem was really operational capacity and UNHCR not having, enough staff on the ground to make the referrals. That problem is largely solved. And now the real problem of the day is the resettlement country quotas and criteria that they lay over the UNHCR resettlement criteria, which again is why unallocated quotas that give UNHCR the discretion to refer the most at-risk cases is just so important. So I think you really hit the nail on the head there.
Thanks, Amy. I'm going to highlight another question here. It says, in some years, UNHCR has published country quota targets alongside the needs. However, that hasn't been consistently public. How would an analysis like this be bolstered by also looking at that data, and what role do these internal operational targets impact equity? I don't know if anybody here would like to attempt to answer that.
I can try to, Sasha. I think we should go ahead and reveal or be honest about the fact that the question came from our RefugePoint colleague, Tamara, who actually worked very closely with us on the production of this report. So she's asking a really good question because she knows the material very well. The issue is that a challenge for us in producing this report is that the data that was publicly available actually changes from one year to the next. Some years, certain data points are available, other years, other data points are available. Some years it's in one format, other years it's in another format. So as Amy described earlier, it's really hard to put it all together into a coherent framework or analysis. And one point that we wanted to try to analyze but couldn't because it wasn't publicly available data for the entire range of our analysis, is this question of targets. So basically what's going on is that UNHCR has its projected needs every year, and states then offer quotas. And then somewhere in the middle, UNHCR creates targets in order to try to meet those quotas from the needs. And the setting of those targets is critical because that then determines the way that resources are distributed through UNHCR operations around the world to try and identify and refer those refugees to meet the quotas from states. And so, yeah, to answer the question, I think that analyzing the targets does really get at the question of equity insofar as it's the targets that in many ways will determine the resource allocation to try and match needs to quotas. I feel like I didn't say that very well, but hopefully at least conveyed the idea that the targets are important because resources follow the targets, and therefore, yes, analyzing the targets would be a valuable contribution to this sort of analysis.
Elvin, could you comment on any of these questions or something that highlights the importance of family reunification?
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you everyone who is here with us today. Very important questions coming from the floor. And as Amy and Marty and Janet have said, one of the major challenges that we have is the criteria that's set by the resettlement countries. On family reunification, maybe I can be able to give a very successful story and what makes our work meaningful and also fulfilling. I'm going to tell you one of the successful stories that I managed to intervene when I was working in Iraq in 2017. And this is a story of a child, a Yazidi child, 12 years old, whom we helped to successfully reunify with the mother who was already resettled in Canada. The child, whom for confidentiality purposes, I'm going to call Hassan, was growing up in his hometown where he was born. Unfortunately, in 2014, Hassan, his hometown was attacked by the ISIS, and he was taken hostage alongside his parents and siblings. While in hostage, he was separated from the mother, the father, and the siblings at the tender age of 8 years old. And when he was taken in hostage, he was subjected to abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. But in 2017, he was wounded and he was left by the ISIS fighters and he was rescued. His picture was posted on the national newspaper, and his mother, who was already in Canada at the time, saw the picture. And through UNHCR and in collaboration with the Canadian government, we were able to reunify the child with the mother within a span of 1 month. Thank you.
Thanks, Elvin. I remember when you were working on that case, and I remember that reunion story, and it gave all of us at RefugePoint just the inspiration to obviously continue, but double down on what we do, because we see results like that because of you in the field. I want to turn it, Janet, back to you, just to comment again on the tension between governments and what they say they want in terms of criteria and the need for needs-based resettlement to save people's lives. Could you comment on that?
Sure, Sasha. And in the report, we are highlighting the need for resettlement to remain protection focused. I joined resettlement very many years ago, working for UNHCR. And at that time, I recall there was a lot of autonomy for UNHCR to push back and insist that resettlement should maintain protection focus when governments would request for cases based on integration criteria such as language and education. Unfortunately, over the years, I think that autonomy has eroded to some degree. And then UNHCR is left stuck. Yes, they're getting quotas, but the type of quotas they're getting are really centered on finding the best fit where immigration is concerned. So I've seen, not in one country, but in a number of countries and regions, insistence on language proficiency, education background, limitations as regards to family. And that compromises a very big aspect. And speaking to the question of governments and advocating for UNHCR to refer the most vulnerable and protection-related cases. I've spoken to UNHCR, and there is quite also sometimes a frustration as we have cases who are most in need, but they don't fit the profile where nationality is concerned or family size, and to a certain degree, their identification and referral criteria is strictly centered around integration-related characteristics rather than protection. So increasingly over the years, we've seen a reduction in first of all, the overall number of cases being submitted, but was still the number of protection cases that are getting those opportunities to really find a protection and a durable solution. So I would say there's definitely a call to recenter resettlement in protection. Thankfully, the growth of complementary pathways will provide avenues for countries that want to use this as immigration channels for other criteria so that we leave resettlement to really remain a protection solution. So thank you, Sasha.
Janet, thank you so much. I love listening to you talk about this. I want to go over, Amy, if you could comment. We're coming to the end of our time now, but I want to hear one last comment about the value and importance of joint advocacy. And I wonder if you could say something about that, and then I'll just share some closing remarks.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I really just wanted to welcome folks on the call to engage with us in joint advocacy. If you're in a position to do so, to reach out to us afterwards. We're already working in coalition with many of you, and we'd really very much welcome kind of a groundswell of support around these advocacy points that then might have more likelihood of succeeding and gaining some traction. So just to put that call out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. I'd like to just, if we could put the link to our blog and the report in the chat again, so that people can access that. I think that would be valuable, because I know when this closes, you won't have access to that. So I'd encourage you just to click on it now, so you have the link in your browser as we come to some closing remarks. This report, Preserving the Humanitarian Nature of Resettlement, is something that we've actually been talking about doing for many, many years. And many years ago, when we created our mission to reach the most at-risk refugees with solutions, we started doing that, but we started asking ourselves, how can we do that more effectively? And how can the broader field do that more effectively? This report is a summation of our aspirations and thoughts around how we can do that. As I said at the start, we have really reached a consequential moment in history. Sadly and tragically, more than 1% of humanity is displaced, and these trends are only going to increase perhaps exponentially. What that means is that resettlement for those most at risk needs to be preserved, while at the same time, we have to look at new pathways for people to get from one place to another to access safety and new lives. RefugePoint is actually a leader in what we've been talking about in terms of complementary pathways, looking at family reunion opportunities that lie outside of legal resettlement channels, looking at labor mobility and education pathways too. All of these are necessary and important, and there are extraordinary opportunities to grow these kinds of complementary pathways, but we don't want to do this at the expense of needs-based resettlement, at the expense of reuniting families, at the expense of those who need resettlement as a life-saving solution. So we're really pleased that we can bring this report to the public, to share it with you, to have this discussion with you, so that you can, I hope, take something away from this. If you're an organization or a government or with one of our partners, this is an opportunity for us to join together to advocate more. If you're somebody who's a supporter and more of simply interested or a philanthropist in these areas, hopefully this has expanded and increased your understanding of these issues and our field. And we're just so pleased again that you've taken the time to join us today. So thank you very much to everyone, and have a wonderful morning, afternoon, and evening.